On the morning of March 14, 1987, air traffic controllers at Miami Center received confirmation that Eastern Airlines Flight 401 had landed safely at John F. Kennedy International Airport in New York. The aircraft, a Lockheed L-1011 TriStar, touched down at Gate 22 at 9:47 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Ground crew approached the aircraft. The jetway extended, but when the door opened, there was no one inside. The passenger manifest listed 176 souls on board. The cockpit was empty. The cabin was empty. And according to every database in the Federal Aviation Administration, Eastern Airlines Flight 401 had ceased operations 14 years earlier, following a crash in the Florida Everglades that killed 101 people. The anomaly was discovered not by the crew or passengers, but by radar, and it began long before anyone realized something was wrong. 6 hours earlier, at 3:12 a.m., a primary radar return appeared on the scope at Nassau Air Traffic Control Center in the Bahamas. The target was moving north-northwest at approximately 480 knots, tracking along Airway Victor 3, a standard route used by commercial traffic transiting between the Caribbean and the southeastern United States. The altitude readout indicated flight level 350, 35,000 feet. The transponder code was 1402. There was no corresponding flight plan on file. The controller on duty, a man named Robert Gaines, attempted to establish radio contact. No response. He tried again on the emergency frequency, 121.5 megahertz. Still nothing. This was not unusual. Aircraft occasionally experience radio failure. Pilots are trained to continue under visual flight rules if conditions allow, or to squawk 7600, the transponder code for lost communications. This target did neither. It simply continued on course, steady and undeviating, as if operated by autopilot. Gaines logged the event and handed off the target to Miami Center as it crossed into United States airspace. The handoff was accepted at 3:29 a.m. by a controller named Vincent Maldonado. He noted the lack of communication, but observed that the aircraft was following a known airway and maintaining standard separation from other traffic. He made the decision to monitor the target without intervention. In his written statement, filed later that morning, Maldonado described the return as clean, stable, and consistent with a heavy commercial jet. At 3:45 a.m., the target began a descent. The altitude readout dropped from flight level 350 to flight level 310 over the course of 4 minutes. The descent rate was smooth, approximately 1,000 feet per minute, well within normal parameters. At 3:50 a.m., the aircraft leveled off at flight level 290. It remained there for 11 minutes. Then, at 4:01 a.m., it began to climb. This was the first irregularity. Aircraft do not typically descend and then climb again without cause. Maldonado considered the possibility of weather avoidance or a pressurization issue, but there were no thunderstorms along the route and no distress signal had been transmitted. He attempted contact again. No response. He alerted his supervisor, a man named Kenneth Ruiz, who instructed him to continue monitoring and to notify the FAA's Air Traffic Quality Assurance Division if the behavior persisted. At 4:18 a.m., the target reached flight level 370. It leveled off and continued north. Speed remained constant at 480 knots. Heading remained constant at 340 degrees. There was no further deviation. Maldonado updated the log and continued his shift. At 5 a.m., the target crossed into Jacksonville Center's airspace. The handoff was accepted. The new controller noted the lack of communication, but observed no unusual flight characteristics. The target proceeded without incident. At 6:32 a.m., the aircraft entered New York Center's airspace. It was now over the Atlantic, approximately 120 nautical miles southeast of Long Island. The controller on duty, a woman named Patricia Colvin, received the handoff and attempted to establish contact. She transmitted on the assigned frequency, then on the emergency frequency, then on the general aviation frequency used by smaller aircraft in the area. There was no response. She noted that the transponder code, 1402, did not correspond to any active flight plan in the system. She queried the database. No match. She contacted her supervisor, who instructed her to treat the aircraft as a potential security threat and to notify the North American Aerospace Defense Command. NORAD was notified at 6:41 a.m. A pair of F-15 interceptors was scrambled from Otis Air National Guard Base in Massachusetts. The fighters reached the target's location at 6:58 a.m. The lead pilot, Captain Raymond Delacroix, reported visual contact with a wide-body commercial airliner, white fuselage, red and blue cheat line, consistent with the livery of a major U.S. carrier. He maneuvered alongside the aircraft and observed the registration number on the tail, N310EA. He relayed this information to NORAD. A database search confirmed that N310EA was a Lockheed L-1011 TriStar, registered to Eastern Airlines. The aircraft had been manufactured in 1972 and had been in service for 11 years before being destroyed in a crash on December 29, 1972. Captain Delacroix was instructed to maintain visual contact and to observe the cockpit for signs of crew activity. He reported that the cockpit windows were dark and no movement was visible. He attempted to signal the aircraft by rocking his wings. No response. He repositioned himself in front of the aircraft and ignited his afterburners, a standard procedure used to get the attention of non-responsive pilots. The L-1011 did not alter course. It continued on a direct heading toward New York airspace. At 7:14 a.m., the decision was made to allow the aircraft to continue. NORAD determined that the aircraft posed no immediate threat, and that attempting to force it down over the ocean would be unnecessarily dangerous. New York Center was instructed to clear all traffic from the aircraft's flight path and to prepare for an uncontrolled arrival at John F. Kennedy International Airport. At 7:40 a.m., the L-1011 began its descent. The rate was standard, approximately 2,500 feet per minute. It followed the published arrival procedure for runway 31L without deviation, as if being flown by an experienced crew familiar with the airport. Patricia Colvin transmitted landing clearance on the emergency frequency, though she did not expect a response. She received none. The aircraft continued its approach. At 9:47 a.m., N310EA touched down on runway 31L. The landing was smooth. The aircraft rolled out to the end of the runway, exited onto taxiway Alpha, and proceeded toward the terminal. Ground personnel, who had been briefed on the situation, maintained a safe distance. Port Authority police vehicles followed the aircraft as it taxied. At 9:52 a.m., the L-1011 came to a stop at Gate 22. The engines spooled down. The aircraft sat motionless. Emergency response teams approached. The jetway was extended. A Port Authority officer opened the forward cabin door. He entered the aircraft and immediately radioed his supervisor. The aircraft was empty. No passengers, no crew. No luggage in the overhead bins. No personal belongings in the seat pockets. The cabin was clean, as if recently serviced. The cockpit was similarly vacant. The controls were in their neutral positions. The autopilot was engaged. The fuel quantity indicator showed 7,200 pounds remaining in the tanks, enough for approximately 45 minutes of flight. The FAA impounded the aircraft and launched an immediate investigation. Inspectors examined every system. They found the airframe to be in excellent condition, with no signs of wear or damage. The engine showed normal operating hours, consistent with a recently overhauled aircraft. The avionics were functional. The flight data recorder was intact. When the data was downloaded, investigators found a complete record of the flight, beginning at 2:54 a.m. over the southern Bahamas and ending at 9:47 a.m. at JFK. The data confirmed the altitude changes, the speeds, and the heading observed by radar. It also recorded fuel burn, engine temperature, and control inputs. Every parameter was consistent with a normally operated flight. The cockpit voice recorder, however, was blank. Not damaged, not malfunctioning, blank. The tape had been erased or had never recorded anything at all. Technicians confirmed that the recorder was properly installed and powered. There was no mechanical reason for the absence of audio. The aircraft's maintenance logs were retrieved from Eastern Airlines archives. N310EA had been delivered to the airline in April 1972. It had accumulated 14,820 flight hours before being retired from service on December 20th, 1972, 9 days before the crash of Flight 401. The aircraft involved in that crash had been a different L1011 registration registration N3 weight TEA. The two aircraft had similar tail numbers. Investigators confirmed that N310EA had been sold to a leasing company in 1973, then to a cargo operator in South America, and had eventually been scrapped in 1981. The airframe had been cut apart at a facility in Bogota, Colombia. Photographic evidence of the scrapping process was located in the leasing company's files. Yet here was the same aircraft, physically present, inspected, and documented, sitting at a gate in New York. The FAA contacted the leasing company. They confirmed the sale and the scrapping. They provided the bill of sale and the certificate of destruction. The serial number matched. The registration matched. But when FAA inspectors compared the data plate inside the forward cargo hold with the records, they found an inconsistency. The manufacturing date on the data plate read April 1972, which was correct. But the total airframe hours stamped into the metal during a major overhaul in 1978 read 31,640 hours. This was impossible. If the aircraft had been scrapped in 1981, it could not have accumulated those hours. A standard L1011, flying an average of 3,000 hours per year, would require more than 10 years to reach that total. Fuel samples were taken from the aircraft's tanks. The fuel was standard Jet A, consistent with fuel available at any major airport in 1987. Chemical analysis revealed trace amounts of tetraethyl lead, an additive used in aviation gasoline during the 1970s, but phased out by the mid-1980s. The concentration was low, but measurable. The lab report noted that the fuel appeared to have been blended from two different sources, one contemporary and one older. The tires on the main landing gear were examined. The rubber showed normal wear, consistent with approximately 200 takeoffs and landings. The date code stamped on the sidewalls indicated that the tires had been manufactured in 1984. This was 3 years after the aircraft had supposedly been destroyed. On March 18th, 4 days after the aircraft's arrival, the National Transportation Safety Board convened a closed hearing. Investigators presented their findings. The aircraft was real. It was airworthy. It had flown from the Bahamas to New York without a crew. Radar had tracked it for more than 6 hours. 2 Air Force pilots had observed it. Ground personnel had seen it land. Yet according to every official record, the aircraft had been destroyed 6 years earlier. The NTSB issued a preliminary report on March 30th. The report summarized the known facts, but offered no conclusions. It noted that the aircraft's origin could not be determined. It noted that no flight plan had been filed. It noted that no passengers or crew had been found. It noted that the cockpit voice recorder contained no data. It noted the discrepancies in the airframe hours, the fuel composition, and the tire date codes. The report ended with a statement that further investigation was required. No further investigation was ever published. The aircraft was moved to a secure hangar at Stewart International Airport in Newburgh, New York. Access was restricted to FAA personnel and NTSB investigators. In June 1987, the hangar was placed under military guard. In October, the aircraft was disassembled. The engines were removed. The wings were detached. The fuselage was cut into sections. Each section was cataloged and placed in storage. No public statement was made regarding the disposal of the aircraft. Requests for information filed under the Freedom of Information Act were denied on the grounds of national security. In 1994, a former Eastern Airlines pilot named Harold Simmons came forward with a statement. Simmons had been employed by the airline from 1968 to 1975. He claimed that on the morning of December 29, 1972, he had been scheduled to fly Flight 401 from Miami to New York. At the last minute, he had been reassigned to a different flight due to a scheduling conflict. The flight he was originally assigned to had been operated by N310EA. That flight had departed Miami at 9:20 p.m. and had landed at JFK at 12:05 a.m. on December 30th. Simmons provided a copy of his logbook, which showed the entry. The entry had been crossed out and replaced with the details of the flight he actually operated. Simmons stated that he had learned of the crash of Flight 401 later that day. He had assumed that the aircraft involved was the same one he had been scheduled to fly. It was not. The aircraft that crashed was N318EA, operating a different flight from New York to Miami. Simmons said he had thought nothing of the confusion until 1987, when he read a brief news article about an unidentified L-1011 landing at JFK. The article mentioned the registration number. Simmons recognized it. He contacted the FAA. His statement was taken, but he was never interviewed by investigators. He died in 2003. In 1998, a radar technician named David Ortega, who had worked at Nassau Air Traffic Control Center in the 1980s, published an article in a regional aviation journal. Ortega described his experience on the morning of March 14, 1987. He had been the technician on duty when the unidentified target appeared on the scope. He stated that the target had not gradually appeared, as aircraft normally do when entering radar coverage. It had simply materialized as if it had not existed a moment before. He described it as a single sweep of the radar. Nothing, then something. He had assumed it was a glitch. But the target had remained on subsequent sweeps, consistent and solid. Ortega wrote that he had reported the anomaly to his supervisor, who had dismissed it as a delayed return from a nearby aircraft. Ortega never mentioned the incident again until after his retirement. In 2001, Vincent Maldonado, the Miami Center controller who had monitored the flight, gave an interview to a private aviation researcher. Maldonado, who had retired from the FAA in 1995, stated that he had reviewed the radar data several times in the weeks following the incident. He said the data showed no gaps, no inconsistencies, and no signs of equipment malfunction. The target had been real. He said he had been instructed not to discuss the incident with anyone outside the FAA. He said he had complied with that instruction for 14 years. He said he did not know why the aircraft had been kept secret. He said he did not know where the crew had gone. He said he had filed a report on March 14th, and he had never seen it again. In 2005, Captain Raymond Delacroix, the F-15 pilot who had intercepted the aircraft, was interviewed by an independent journalist. Delacroix confirmed that he had visually identified the L-1011 and that he had seen no one in the cockpit. He described the aircraft as pristine, like it had just rolled off the assembly line. He said the livery had been bright and unfaded, which struck him as unusual for an aircraft that should have been 15 years old. He said he had filed a mission report and had been debriefed by Air Force intelligence officers. He said he had been told not to discuss the incident. He said he had followed that order until after his retirement in 2003. The FAA has never released a final report on the incident. The NTSB has never updated its preliminary findings. Requests for radar data, flight recordings, and inspection reports have been denied or returned with heavily redacted documents. The only publicly available information is the preliminary NTSB report from March 30th, 1987, which is 4 pages long and contains no analysis. In 2012, a researcher named Dr. Evelyn Marsh, a physicist specializing in atmospheric phenomena, published a paper examining radar anomalies in the vicinity of the Bermuda Triangle. Marsh reviewed thousands of radar records from the 1980s and identified 12 instances of unexplained primary returns that appeared suddenly, followed predictable flight paths, and then either disappeared or in one case landed. Marsh did not speculate on the cause. She noted only that the returns were consistent with solid objects and that no mechanical or atmospheric explanation could account for their sudden appearance. Her paper was published in a peer-reviewed journal, but received little attention outside academic circles. The aircraft that landed at JFK on March 14, 1987 was real. It was documented, inspected, and disassembled. The radar returns were real. The interceptor pilots were real. The air traffic controllers were real. But the flight, according to every database, every schedule, and every record kept by the FAA and Eastern Airlines, did not exist. No tickets were sold. No passengers checked in. No crew reported for duty. There was no gate assignment, no fuel order, no catering request, and no departure time. The only evidence of the flight is the aircraft itself, and the 6 hours and 35 minutes of radar data that tracked it from the Bahamas to New York. The fuel in the tanks was enough for 45 minutes of flight. The flight had lasted 6.5 hours. A Lockheed L-1011 burns approximately 13,000 pounds of fuel per hour at cruise altitude. To complete the flight, the aircraft would have required at least 84,000 pounds of fuel. It landed with 7,200 pounds. The difference is 76,800 pounds. There is no record of a refueling stop. There is no airport along the route where the aircraft could have landed and taken off again without being observed. The fuel burn does not match the flight time. And no one has explained how an aircraft that was destroyed in 1981 was sitting at a gate in New York in 1987, its systems operational, its airframe intact, and its data recorder showing a flight that began 6 hours earlier. The jetway was extended at 9:52 a.m. The door was opened, and the aircraft was empty. If you follow aviation mysteries and unexplained incidents, subscribe for future investigations.